Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are my 5 ways to fix the card, the Runespear. Now, of course, the first thing anyone should ask is, why does the Runespear need a fix? This is Shaman's new legendary weapon from Kobolds and Catacombs, and quite frankly, it is absolutely terrible. This card is unplayably bad. Some people out there might say, Regis, I've ran the Runespear in a deck, and I've won games. That's certainly possible, but when you look at the data for this card, particularly pulled from hsreplay.net, you can see that it only has a 42% win rate right now, which is awful. And on top of that, it actually lowers the win rate of decks that it's in when it's played. So it's clear that this card itself is actively hurting the win rates of any decks that seem to include it for whatever reason. Usually when you think of late game legendary cards that you run in your deck, they drastically increase the win rate of any given deck they're in, because if you've made it to turn 8 and you found the time to play your big late game legendary, that probably means you've started to stabilize, you're going to pull ahead in the game, you're a control deck, you're going to win. The story for Runespear is completely different. It actually hurts your win rate by almost 6%. So playing this card is pretty much the worst thing you could possibly do in Shaman decks that try to squeeze it into their list. So sure, you can win a game here and there with the Runespear, but all of the data, all of the evidence so far suggests this card is bad, and frankly, just looking at it from a subjective standpoint, it's not hard to tell why. It's an incredibly high-costed weapon with low direct stats, and its Discover effect here is so loaded down and bogged down with randomness that it's just hard to make any sort of sense in a coherent fashion, meeting any sort of strategy or game plan. It just doesn't do what you need it to do when you need it to do, and you commit a ton of mana to doing nothing. So all of that said, I think it's quite clear that we need to fix the Runespear. And your response, again, might be, well, Regis, it's okay to have bad cards in the game. I agree with that. Not every card has to be a high-tier perfect card. Not everything needs to be the defining card for its class, but I think it's particularly unfortunate when cards like the Runespear are awarded for free for people in Kobolds and Catacombs. Everybody got a legendary weapon just for logging into the game. And if you get a free legendary weapon and it's terrible, that's a heartbreaking experience. Nobody wants to go through that when their free legendary just sits and it rots, or alternatively, it just turns into a measly 400 dust. I don't want that for anybody. I want these cards to at least be playable, if not in a high competitive deck, in some at least fun or meme fashion, without completely compromising your ability to play Hearthstone effectively. And right now, since Shaman's so bad, and this card in particular is so bad, that's just not the case. So to me, there's very little question that Runespear deserves a fix. It needs to be a better card, and I've got a few ideas here on how we can do that, so let's go ahead and jump into my fixes for the Runespear. Up first, I have a really simple change here, and this is the kind of elegant, graceful change that Blizzard would likely implement if they ever buffed cards. Of course, they don't really have a tendency to buff cards in the history of Hearthstone so far, so don't count on this one ever actually getting improved. But if it were to be buffed, I think this is how they do it, which is very simply just to reduce its mana cost. This card normally costs 8. Here in this mockup, I have dropped it down to 6 mana. And a 2 mana change is a huge difference. That's a sweeping, enormous change compared to Blizzard, who always just changes things by 1 mana. And you might ask why I've kind of doubled up that discount. And that's because Runespear is just so far away from being good. It has so many downsides that it doesn't start to feel good at 6 mana. And frankly, I kind of thought maybe 5 mana felt reasonable as well, but it seemed like 6 was the true middle ground. But even at 5 mana, just a 3/3 weapon, that's not an amazing stat line for 5 mana, and sometimes since this effect actually has some downside, or at least a lot of times it just completely whiffs and doesn't do anything you want at all, it's not necessarily worth that many extra mana points. But since it gets to go off 3 times, theoretically, that value can start to stack up, and you do have to pay a little bit, whereas this would normally probably just be a 4 mana weapon. You're kind of paying 2 mana extra for 3 random spells. So it feels a little better at 6 mana. This would give you more time to play it. Wouldn't have to come later in the game where your opponent has a ton of stuff they've accomplished and you're basically kind of passing a turn on a potential good play. This means you can combo more things with it in a single turn. You can play it earlier in the game so you're at less risk, all of which just adds up to making it a more playable card. So this is probably exactly what Blizzard would do, although they would probably just make it 7 mana, which would still leave the card in a terrible state. But a mana cost reduction is a pretty nice, easy fix that would certainly make the card more playable. And now moving on to my second change, this one's actually pretty similar in that it's just a number tweak on this card. Instead of reducing the mana cost, you could also just bump up the stat value for the card as well. So here I've taken it from a 3/3 up to a 5/4, giving it 5 attack, 4 durability. Of course, this does a couple things. This gives you 1 extra random spell, so this effect lasts longer over the course of the game and allows it to stack up for more expected value over multiple turns. That still keeps it a pretty slow card, though, because it takes so long to actually get your expected value out of it. To fix that, of course, you can increase the attack value a little bit. So taking it from 3 to 5 means it's much better at killing mid-range threats, the kinds of things you're likely to see on turns 7, 8, 9, etc. Things at 5 health show up much more often than 3 health that late in the game. So this often would have a more immediate impact for clearing a minion, so it doesn't feel like you're passing a turn or passing so much tempo back to your opponent, therefore giving you just a little bit more time to squeak it out because you feel like you're still accomplishing something on top of that immediate random spell. You're also getting a minion, and that might feel okay from time to time for 8 mana. So this just gives it a little bit more instant effect, a little bit more long-term value, both of which the card desperately needs to actually see any sort of play. So moving on to my third fix here, this one's a little bit different and maybe a fix in the wrong direction because it actually adds more randomness, not necessarily something I like to see a ton of in Hearthstone, but it certainly changes the intensity of this card's effect without losing the spirit of it. Because, of course, in all these changes, I don't want to change the spirit of the card. Certainly, you could make drastic changes that completely reshape the card and make it better, but I want it to feel kind of the same. So in this case, we keep the same value for mana and stats, but the effect changes, and instead of discovering a spell and then casting a single spell with random targets, in this case, you would just attack and it would instantly cast 3 random spells, no discovering. So some people might say, well, Regis, gosh, that's actually going to make it worse because you don't get to discover anything. Discovering at least gives you a little bit of control. That's a very fair point. But on the other hand, the fact that it casts 3 random spells, that's 3 times as much immediate impact. So it's just going to do more. And Shaman does have a fairly decent sample size of spells that are always good, or at least not harmful. Things like Bloodlust, for instance, when that casts, it never punishes you. And since there are a handful of those, very likely most of the time, you're going to get at least 1 or 2 decent things out of this Runespear effect here as it's translated on this card. You might get 1 or 2 that are bad occasionally, but at least things are going to happen. Essentially, that amount of chaos, that intensity of chaos, tends to breed positive effects in the long run, something you see with a card like Yogg-Saron. Essentially, if you're casting enough randomness, enough craziness, you tend to win out on average just because there are more spells that either help you or do nothing than spells that are objectively bad. So since 3 times as many things are happening, it just allows the card to do more, make a more direct and immediate influence on the game as opposed to such a slow and passive influence as it stands now. And frankly, even when you're discovering cards with Runespear, sometimes you still just get cards that are either potentially going to hurt you or just do nothing. So the fact that it's multiplying that by 3 is just going to be a more favorable outcome in general, I think, I propose at least, than the way it works right now. So again, not necessarily a healthy change, not something I would like to see because it's just so chaotic, but an effect that I do think would ultimately make the card much better while retaining the idea and the spirit of the card, which is casting random spells and being a little bit chaotic, for better or for worse. So now for my fourth proposed change to the Runespear to make it better. This one is almost in the opposite direction of the last one. And this is where you still get to discover a spell like you do with the Runespear as it stands in the game today, but instead of just casting it immediately with random targets, this would add it to your hand at 0 cost. So essentially, it's just drawing you a card that costs 0, and that's a huge advantage over casting it with random targets. Because if you get things like Lava Burst right now, if you're Runespear, you might not be able to cast it because you're scared it's going to hit you in the face or kill one of your minions. It's just too risky. But if you got Lava Burst and you were able to add it to your hand and cast it on demand later, that's putting so much more influence and control and strategy and decision making in the power of the player because you don't have to play it immediately. You can wait a couple turns till an opportunity exists. You can bank that that Bloodlust to cast it later. You can save a Lightning Storm for when there's actually a board of minions. It just gives you the control, and that's so much better than the randomness. I love this design. So the Runespear basically becomes an almost card draw engine of sorts that's still a high tempo opportunity eventually, but you get to bank that tempo. So if you need it immediately, you can still do that. If you need it later, you've got the decision-making influence. You can do it later too. That makes the card feel 10,000 times better, because it could still be good against aggro if you're desperately looking for a Lightning Storm that turn, but you could also use it against control to give you certain tools and utility pieces for later down the road in the game when you actually need them. And I think just that increased consistency would take this card so much farther than it is today. It would still only fit in certain kinds of slower decks, but it would actually be playable and have a ton of upside. So I would personally love to see this change. And then finally here for my fifth fix, this is another one that's kind of a simple change in a way, but very fitting for the card, and in fact very fitting for Shaman in general, and that is to simply give the card Wind Fury. And since it's got Wind Fury and, you know, 2 attacks or multiples of 2, you want to bump the durability of it up by 1 as well, so you actually get to use it 4 times instead of just 3. So give it Wind Fury, toss it 1 extra durability, so you can actually use the Wind Fury twice. And much like the third suggestion on this list, where you just, if you have more random events, they tend to add up in more positive and impactful ways, this one does the exact same thing. So you get to attack twice. So first off, that makes it essentially almost a 6 damage weapon the turn you play it, which again is way better for killing things the turn you play it. So it feels far less slow when you're playing it on that 8 mana turn. It's actually impacting the board directly right away, which is nice, but also you're getting 2 spells, and sometimes you could utilize those together to do some interesting things, like double Lightning Storms perhaps, if you were given those odds. And other times you might just get 1 whiff and 1 good one, so it increases the likelihood that you're actually going to do something you want in any given turn, which again makes it feel less bad to commit so much mana to the card, because it's having double the impact right away, and increasing the consistency a little bit as well. And then even next turn too, you get to do the same thing again, and it's double power next turn. Now, it's only over 2 turns instead of 3, but you get 4 total spells instead of just 3, and that's a huge difference, and they basically happen over 2 turns. And I think putting it into play that much faster would allow you to do some really cool things without passing up so much tempo as the card requires today. Not to mention Wind Fury is just a Shaman thing, so it seems like an obvious fit anyway. I'm almost surprised this card wasn't exactly this the first time around. This feels like a balanced option for the card that fits the class, and it looks right. It would actually be playable. I can't believe Blizzard didn't just go ahead and do this. So in a lot of ways, I think this is actually my favorite version of the Runespear. I saved it for last, perhaps, because it was the best. Just give the thing Wind Fury. Even if you don't toss it to an extra durability like I did here, I think still just giving Wind Fury would make it that much faster to play the turn you played it, and that would fix the card in so many different ways. How is this not already in the game? This is the perfect fix for the Runespear. And all that said, guys, here I have 5 ways to make the Runespear better. Frankly, I'd take any of them. I certainly have some preferences. Some fit Blizzard's design philosophy better than others. But all that said, I'm curious what you guys think about the Runespear. What do you think's wrong with the card? What are its problems? How can it be fixed? Does it need to be fixed? Is it really just symptomatic of Shaman being a weaker class right now? Does the Runespear actually have potential to be successful in the future? Of course, I want to hear your thoughts on this one, my fixes as well. Share all of that in the comments below. But until then, everybody, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.